The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as Officer David checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. It was 8:47 a.m., and his shift had started exactly 47 minutes ago. He had been working as a Royal Guard for nearly 8 years now, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that most days started exactly like this one. Quiet, predictable, and filled with tourists who wanted to take selfies with the famous red uniformed guards. David adjusted his heavy ceremonial hat and took a deep breath of the crisp September air. The autumn season was his favorite time to work the perimeter. The summer crowds had thinned out considerably, which meant fewer people trying to climb the gates and fewer children crying because they couldn't see over the crowd. Don't get him wrong. He loved seeing families enjoy their visits to the palace, but sometimes the peace and quiet was exactly what he needed. His partner Jake was stationed at the main entrance about 200 meters away. They had worked together for 3 years, and they had developed a system of silent communication that worked perfectly for situations like this. A simple nod meant everything was normal. A raised hand meant pay attention. A wave meant trouble was brewing. As David walked his regular route along the eastern fence, he noticed the usual morning characters. There was Mrs. Peterson, an elderly lady who walked her small white dog past the palace every single day at exactly 9 a.m. She always wore the same purple coat and always stopped to wave at whichever guard was on duty. Today she was running about 5 minutes early, which was unusual for her. Then there was the businessman in the expensive suit who power-walked past every morning while talking loudly on his phone. David had been watching this man for months and had figured out that he worked in finance and was probably having relationship problems based on the phone conversations he couldn't help but overhear. The morning joggers were out in full force, too. There was the woman with the bright pink running shoes who always smiled and said good morning, and the older gentleman who ran with his golden retriever every day at precisely 8:30 a.m. These people had become part of David's daily routine, and their presence was oddly comforting. But it was the unusual things that David was trained to notice. The people who didn't fit the normal patterns. The individuals who seemed nervous or out of place. The vehicles that lingered too long or drove past multiple times. After 8 years of doing this job, his eyes had become trained to spot anything that didn't belong. That's why he immediately noticed the little girl in the bright red jacket. She was standing near the corner of Victoria Street, about 50 meters from where David was positioned. The child looked to be around 6 or 7 years old, with blonde hair tied up in 2 small ponytails. She was wearing a red winter jacket that was probably too warm for the current weather, dark blue jeans, and small white sneakers that looked brand new. What caught David's attention wasn't just that she was alone, although that was certainly concerning. It was the way she was acting. The little girl kept looking around in all directions like she was searching for someone. She would take a few steps in one direction, then stop and look around again, then walk back to where she started. David had seen lost children before, and they usually cried or called out for their parents. This girl was different. She seemed scared, but she wasn't making any noise. She was clutching something tightly against her chest, and when David looked more carefully, he could see it was a small stuffed animal. Looked like a rabbit or maybe a bear. The child's behavior was setting off alarm bells in David's head. In his 8 years of experience, he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about this situation didn't feel right. David began walking slowly in the girl's direction, trying to appear casual while keeping his eyes on her. He didn't want to scare her by approaching too quickly, but he also didn't want to lose sight of her if she decided to wander off. As he got closer, he could see that the girl's face was flushed, like she had been crying or was about to cry. Her little hands were gripping the stuffed animal so tightly that her knuckles were white. She kept looking down the street in both directions, as if she was expecting someone to appear. David was about 30 meters away when he noticed something else that made his stomach tighten with worry. The girl wasn't just looking around randomly. She seemed to be looking for a way to cross the busy street. Victoria Street was always packed with traffic during morning rush hour, and the idea of a small child trying to cross alone was terrifying. He quickened his pace slightly, but tried to keep his movements smooth and non-threatening. The last thing he wanted was to frighten an already scared child. That's when he saw the white van. It was a plain delivery van, the kind you see dozens of every day in London. White paint, no company logos or decorations, tinted windows on the sides. It was driving slowly down Victoria Street, much slower than the normal traffic flow. The van passed by the little girl once, continued down the street for about a block, then made a U-turn and came back. David felt his training kick in immediately. Vehicles that circled back to the same location were always worth watching. It could be nothing. Maybe the driver was lost or looking for a parking space. But it could also be something much more serious. The van pulled over to the curb about 50 meters from where the little girl was standing. David could see two figures in the front seats, but the tinted windows made it impossible to make out any details about them. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The van just sat there with the engine running. The little girl seemed to notice it too, because she took a few steps backward, moving closer to the palace fence. Then the van's passenger door opened. A man stepped out, and David immediately began cataloging details. Middle-aged, maybe 45 to 50 years old, average height and build. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, which made it hard to see his features clearly. Dark jacket, blue jeans, brown shoes that looked worn and comfortable. The man looked around carefully before closing the van door. Then he started walking directly toward the little girl. David's hand instinctively moved to his radio. He wasn't ready to call for backup yet, but he wanted to be prepared. The man could be the girl's father or a family member who had been looking for her, but something about the way he was approaching, slow, cautious, looking around to see if anyone was watching, made David's professional instinct scream that this was wrong. The man was now about 20 meters from the child. He had something in his hand. David squinted and could see what looked like a small bag of candy or maybe a chocolate bar. The man was holding it out toward the girl and saying something that David couldn't hear from his position. The little girl took another step backward. David began moving faster, no longer caring about appearing casual. His 8 years of training and experience were telling him that he was about to witness something terrible, and he was the only person in position to stop it. David's heart rate picked up as he watched the man in the baseball cap continue his slow approach toward the little girl. Every instinct he had developed over 8 years of security work was telling him that this situation was about to go very wrong very quickly. The man was now close enough that David could see him more clearly. He appeared to be in his late 40s, with a thick build and weathered hands that suggested he worked with them for a living. His baseball cap was pulled down low, casting shadows over his face, but David could make out a scruffy beard and what looked like a nervous smile. What really caught David's attention was how the man kept glancing around while he walked. Not the casual looking around that people do when they're in an unfamiliar area, but the quick darting glances of someone who was checking to see if they were being watched. David had seen this behavior before during his training, and it was never a good sign. The little girl had backed up against the iron fence that surrounded the palace grounds. She was still clutching her stuffed rabbit, and David could see that she was trembling slightly. The child's instincts were clearly telling her that something wasn't right about this stranger approaching her. "Hey there, sweetie," David heard the man say as he got closer to the girl. His voice was artificially friendly, the kind of tone adults use when they're trying too hard to sound harmless. "Are you lost? I think I can help you find your mommy." The man held out what David could now see was definitely a chocolate bar. It was still in its wrapper, and he was waving it slightly to get the girl's attention. "Look what I have for you. Your mommy asked me to give this to you." David felt his stomach drop. He had heard those exact words before during a training session about child safety. The instructors had explained that predators often use the promise of treats and the mention of parents to gain a child's trust. The fact that this stranger was using textbook manipulation tactics made David's blood run cold. The little girl shook her head and pressed herself even closer to the fence. "I don't know you," she said in a small voice that David could barely hear. "My mommy said not to talk to strangers." "Oh, but I'm not really a stranger," the man replied, taking another step closer. "Your mommy sent me to find you. She's been looking everywhere for you. She's very worried." David was now close enough to intervene, but he wanted to get a little closer before making his move. He also wanted to see if there were any other people involved in this situation. His eyes went back to the white van, and what he saw made his blood pressure spike even higher. The driver's side door had opened and a second man was getting out. This one was younger, maybe in his 20s or early 30s. He was tall and thin, with dark hair and a nervous energy that was obvious even from a distance. Unlike the first man, this one wasn't trying to appear friendly or harmless. He was scanning the area like a lookout, his eyes moving constantly from person to person, car to car. The younger man's behavior was textbook criminal lookout activity. David had seen it dozens of times during his years of security work. The way he positioned himself, the way he kept checking his watch, the way he seemed ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble, it all screamed that this was a planned operation. David reached for his radio with one hand while continuing to walk toward the situation. He needed backup and he needed it fast. But he also couldn't wait for help to arrive. The first man was now less than 3 meters from the little girl, and she was running out of places to back up. "Dispatch, this is Officer David at the East Perimeter," he said quietly into his radio, trying to keep his voice low enough that the suspects wouldn't hear him. "I have a possible 1021 in progress. Request immediate backup to my location." The dispatcher's voice crackled back immediately. "Copy that, David. Units are en route. ETA 3 minutes." 3 minutes felt like an eternity when David looked at the scene unfolding in front of him. The man with the baseball cap was now crouching down to the little girl's eye level, still holding out the chocolate bar. The younger man by the van was getting more agitated by the second, constantly looking up and down the street. "Come on, honey," the older man was saying. "Your mommy is waiting for you in my van. She sent me to bring you to her because she couldn't find a parking space. You want to see your mommy, don't you?" The little girl's eyes went wide with fear. Even at her young age, she seemed to understand that something was very wrong with this situation. "My mommy wouldn't send a stranger," she said, her voice getting smaller and more frightened. "She told me never to go with people I don't know." David could see that the man was getting frustrated with the girl's resistance. His fake smile was starting to slip, and there was an edge creeping into his voice. "Listen, little girl. Your mommy is really worried about you. If you don't come with me right now, she's going to be very upset." The change in the man's tone seemed to trigger something in the younger lookout. He started walking quickly toward his partner and the little girl, his hands moving restlessly at his sides. David could see that the situation was about to escalate rapidly. "Time to go," the younger man called out in a low, urgent voice. "We need to move now." That was all David needed to hear. The two men were clearly working together, and they were about to try to take the little girl by force. David dropped all pretense of casual observation and broke into a run toward the group. "Hey!" he shouted in his most authoritative voice. "Royal Guard, stop right there!" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The little girl's head snapped up with relief written all over her face. The older man jerked upright and spun around, his eyes going wide when he saw David's uniform and the fact that he was running directly toward them. The younger man by the van immediately started shouting, "Go, go, go! We need to leave now!" But the older man seemed frozen for a crucial few seconds. He looked at David, then at the little girl, then back at David again. David could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to decide whether to run or try to bluff his way out of the situation. David was now less than 20 meters away and closing fast. "Step away from the child," he commanded, his voice carrying all the authority of his 8 years of training and experience. "Put your hands where I can see them." The man in the baseball cap finally seemed to snap out of his indecision. He dropped the chocolate bar and started backing, away from the little girl. But he wasn't moving toward the van. Instead, he was moving parallel to the street like he was trying to figure out which direction to run. The younger man had already made his decision. He was running back toward the van, shouting something that David couldn't quite make out over the sound of traffic and his own heavy breathing. David was close enough now to see the panic in both men's eyes. They had clearly expected this to be a quick, easy operation, and the sudden appearance of an armed security officer had thrown their entire plan into chaos. The little girl, meanwhile, had started crying with relief. She was still pressed against the fence, but now she was looking at David like he was the answer to her prayers. The next few seconds felt like they were happening in slow motion. even though David knew his adrenaline was making everything speed up around him. The older man in the baseball cap was still standing there, looking back and forth between David and the little girl like he couldn't decide what to do next. His fake friendly expression had completely disappeared, replaced by the look of someone who had just realized their plan was falling apart. David could hear his own breathing as he closed the final distance between himself and the group. His 8 years of training had prepared him for situations like this, but actually living through it was completely different from any exercise or simulation he had ever done. The weight of his uniform, the responsibility of protecting an innocent child, and the very real danger of the situation all combined to create a level of intensity he had never experienced before. "I said step away from the child," David repeated, his voice even more commanding than before. He was now close enough to see the sweat on the older man's forehead and the way his hands were shaking slightly. "Put your hands up and step back." The little girl had stopped crying and was looking at David with a mixture of hope and continued fear. She was smart enough to understand that the man in the uniform was trying to help her, but she was still too scared to move away from the fence, where she had been trying to hide. Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," the older man said, putting on a nervous smile and raising his hands slightly. But David noticed that he didn't actually step away from the child. If anything, he seemed to be positioning himself between David and the little girl. "This is my niece. She wandered off and got lost, and I was just trying to help her get back to her mother." David had heard every variation of this lie during his training. Criminals always claimed to be relatives when they were caught in situations like this. The problem was that sometimes it was actually true, which made David's job much more complicated. But there were ways to tell the difference, and David's instincts were telling him that this man was definitely lying. "What's her name?" David asked, keeping his eyes locked on the man while also trying to monitor the younger accomplice who was still standing by the van. The older man hesitated for just a split second too long. "Her name is, Katie. Her name is Katie." David looked down at the little girl. "Is your name Katie, sweetheart?" The child shook her head immediately. "No, my name is Lucy, and he's not my uncle. I don't know him." The man's face changed completely when he heard this. The nervous smile disappeared, and David could see anger and desperation starting to take its place. This was the moment David had been trained to watch out for, when a criminal realizes their lies aren't working, and they have to decide whether to give up or escalate the situation. "She's confused," the man said, but his voice was getting more aggressive. "She's been lost for a while and she's scared. Kids get mixed up when they're frightened." David took another step closer, making sure to position himself directly between the man and the little girl. "Lucy, do you know where your mommy is right now?" "She's at work," the little girl said in a small voice. "I was walking to school with my friend Anna, but then I saw a pretty butterfly and I followed it and then I got lost." This information hit David like a punch to the stomach. The child had been on her way to school when she got separated from her friend. That meant her parents probably didn't even know she was missing yet. It also meant that these men had been specifically looking for a vulnerable, isolated child. Exactly the kind of predatory behavior David had been trained to recognize. Older man must have realized that his story was completely falling apart, because he suddenly changed tactics. "Look, officer, I understand you're just doing your job, but you're making a big mistake here. This little girl approached me and asked for help. I was just trying to be a good citizen." "Is that true, Lucy?" David asked, never taking his eyes off the man. "Did you ask this man for help?" "No," the little girl said immediately. "He came up to me and said my mommy sent him, but I knew that wasn't true because my mommy is at work and she would never send a stranger to get me." David felt a surge of pride for this brave little girl. Despite being scared and lost, she had remembered the safety lessons her parents had obviously taught her. Her smart thinking and refusal to go with the stranger had probably saved her life. The younger man by the van was getting more agitated by the minute. David could see him pacing back and forth, constantly checking his watch and looking up and down the street. He kept gesturing to his partner, clearly wanting him to abandon the situation and run. "We need to go, now!" the younger man finally called out, no longer trying to keep his voice down. "This is taking too long." That's when David realized just how serious this situation really was. These weren't just two random criminals who had spotted an opportunity. They were working together with what appeared to be a plan and a timeline. The younger man's urgency suggested that they had other places to be or other activities planned. This was organized professional criminal behavior. David spoke into his radio again, keeping his voice calm and clear despite his racing heart. "Dispatch, I need those backup units immediately. I have 2 suspects attempting child abduction. One is directly engaging with the victim. The other is acting as lookout by a white delivery van." "Copy that, David. First units are 30 seconds out." 30 seconds felt like an eternity, but David knew he could handle the situation for that long. The key was to keep both suspects in sight while protecting the child and not letting the situation escalate into violence. The older man had obviously heard David's radio call, and the news that backup was almost there seemed to trigger a change in his behavior. The fake politeness completely disappeared, replaced by open desperation. "You're making a huge mistake, officer," he said, and now his voice had a threatening edge to it. "You don't understand what you're interfering with here." David felt his training kick in completely. The man's change in tone and body language indicated that he was moving from the convince phase to the threaten phase. This was often the most dangerous moment in confrontations like this, because desperate people sometimes made very bad decisions. "Sir, I need you to take 3 steps backward and put your hands on your head," David said, his voice carrying all the authority he could muster. "Do it now." Instead of complying, the man took a step toward David. Not a big step, but definitely in the wrong direction. David could see the calculation in the man's eyes. He was trying to figure out if he could somehow get past David to grab the child. The younger man by the van had stopped pacing and was now staring intently at his partner and David. David could practically feel the tension building, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to vibrate with potential energy. That's when David heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant wail of police sirens getting closer by the second. Backup was almost there, and both suspects could hear it too. The effect on both men was immediate and dramatic. The older man's face went pale, and the younger one started shouting again. "That's it. We're done. Get in the van right now." But the older man seemed frozen with indecision. He looked at David, then at the approaching sirens, then at the little girl who was still pressed against the fence. David could see him wrestling with whether to run, fight, or surrender. The sound of police sirens was getting louder by the second, and David could see the first police car turning the corner about 2 blocks away. But those few seconds before backup arrived felt like the longest moments of his entire career. The older man was still standing there, his eyes darting between David, the little girl, and the approaching sirens. David could practically see the panic building in his expression. "This is your last chance to make the smart choice," David said, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Step away from the child and put your hands where I can see them." Instead of backing down, the man seemed to make a desperate decision. He suddenly lunged toward little Lucy, clearly intending to grab her and use her as some kind of shield or bargaining chip. David's training kicked in instantly, and he moved to intercept the man before he could reach the frightened child. The 2 men collided with an impact that David felt through his entire body. The suspect was heavier than David had expected, but David had the advantage of training and the motivation of protecting an innocent child. They grappled for what felt like minutes but was probably only a few seconds, with David trying to pin the man's arms while keeping himself between the criminal and Lucy. "Run, Lucy!" David shouted while struggling with the suspect. "Run toward the police cars!" The brave little girl didn't need to be told twice. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly and ran as fast as her small legs could carry her, heading directly toward the approaching police vehicles. David felt a huge sense of relief knowing that she was getting to safety, even though he was still wrestling with her would-be kidnapper. The younger man by the van had apparently decided that his partner was on his own. David could hear the van's engine revving loudly, and when he managed to glance in that direction, he saw the vehicle pulling away from the curb. The getaway driver was abandoning his accomplice and fleeing the scene. This seemed to break something in the older man's spirit. When he realized that his partner had left him behind, the fight seemed to go out of him all at once. He stopped struggling against David and instead just stood there breathing heavily, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's over," David said, still keeping a firm grip on the man's arm. "Don't make this any worse for yourself." The first police car screeched to a halt just a few meters away from them, and David had never been so happy to see backup in his life. Two officers jumped out immediately, with one heading straight toward David and the suspect while the other went to check on Lucy. "Officer David, Palace Security," David announced to the approaching policeman. "This man attempted to abduct that little girl. His accomplice just fled in a white delivery van heading east on Victoria Street." The police officer, a sergeant with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had seen everything, nodded grimly and immediately radioed the description of the fleeing van to other units in the area. Within seconds, David could hear multiple police cars responding to the call, their sirens filling the morning air as they gave chase to the escaped suspect. While the sergeant was handling the arrest of the older man, David walked over to where the other officer was kneeling down next to Lucy. The little girl was no longer crying, but she was still clutching her stuffed rabbit like her life depended on it. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" David asked gently, crouching, down to her eye level. Lucy shook her head. "No, I'm okay. But I was really scared. Thank you for helping me." The police officer smiled kindly at her. "You were very brave, Lucy. You did exactly the right thing by not going with that stranger, even when he said he knew your mommy." "My mommy always told me never to go with people I don't know," Lucy said proudly. "She said that even if someone says they know her, I should never go with them unless she's there too." David felt his heart swell with admiration for this smart, brave little girl and for the parents who had obviously prepared her so well for a dangerous situation. Her quick thinking and refusal to be fooled by the criminal's lies had probably saved her life. More police cars were arriving every minute, and David could see that a full investigation was about to begin. Detective units, forensics teams, and supervisors were all converging on the scene. What had started as a routine morning patrol had turned into one of the most serious incidents of David's career. The police sergeant who had arrested the older suspect walked back over to David and, "Lucy, we're going to need to take statements from both of you," he said. "But first we need to get this little one back to her family." "My daddy is at home," Lucy said in a small voice. "He doesn't go to work until later. And my mommy works at the big building with all the glass windows." David smiled. "Don't worry, Lucy. These police officers are going to help you get back to your family. They're very good at finding people." While they were talking, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. The arresting officers were searching the older suspect, and they had found several items that were deeply disturbing. There was a roll of duct tape in his jacket pocket, along with what looked like a small bottle of some kind of liquid and a pair of zip tie restraints. The police sergeant caught David's eye and nodded grimly. These weren't just tools for a simple kidnapping. They were items that suggested something much more sinister had been planned for little Lucy. "Officer David," the sergeant said quietly, pulling him aside, "we're going to need you to come to the station later to give a full statement. What you interrupted here today, this was serious. Very serious." David nodded, feeling the full weight of what had almost happened. If he hadn't been paying attention, if he hadn't trusted his instincts, if he had been just a few minutes later in his patrol route, this story could have had a completely different ending. A new police car pulled up, and David could see that this one was different from the others. It was an unmarked detective vehicle, and the woman who got out was clearly a senior investigator. She walked directly over to where the suspect was being held and began examining the items that had been found in his pockets. After a few minutes of discussion with the other officers, the detective walked over to David. "Officer, I'm Detective Rodriguez. I need to ask you some questions about what you observed here today." "Of course," David replied. "Whatever you need." The items we found on this suspect, combined with his behavior and the presence of an accomplice with a vehicle, suggest this was part of a much larger operation, the detective explained. "We think you may have stumbled onto something significant." David felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean by larger operation?" We've been investigating a series of attempted child abductions in this area over the past several weeks. The pattern of behavior you described, 2 men, one to approach the child and one as a lookout with a van, matches exactly what we've been looking for. The detective paused and looked over at Lucy, who was now talking animatedly with one of the officers about her stuffed rabbit. If our suspicions are correct, your quick action today didn't just save one little girl. You may have helped us catch criminals who were responsible for multiple incidents. David looked back at the white van, which had now been surrounded by police cars about 3 blocks away. Through his radio, he could hear that the second suspect had been apprehended and was being brought back to the scene. The morning that had started so quietly and routinely had turned into something that would probably change the lives of everyone involved. 3 hours after the arrest, David found himself sitting in an interview room at the local police station, going through every detail of the morning's events with Detective Rodriguez. The adrenaline had finally worn off, and he was starting to realize just how significant this incident had been. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline correctly," Detective Rodriguez said, flipping through her notes. "You first noticed the little girl at approximately 9:15 a.m., observed suspicious vehicle behavior at 9:20, and made contact with the suspects at 9:25? David nodded. "That's right. The whole thing happened very quickly, but those 10 minutes felt like hours while I was watching it unfold." The detective smiled grimly. "Your attention to detail and quick response time probably saved not just Lucy's life, but prevented several other children from becoming victims. We've been tracking this group for 2 months." She opened a thick file folder and spread several photographs across the table. David's stomach dropped when he saw what was in front of him. The photos showed the same white van from different locations around London, always parked near schools, playgrounds, or other places where children might be found alone. "We've connected your 2 suspects to at least 4 other attempted abductions in the past 8 weeks, Detective Rodriguez explained. In each case, they use the same pattern. One man approaches the child while claiming to be sent by the Diob parents, while the other acts as lookout with the van. David studied the photos more carefully. Were they successful in any of these other attempts? The detective's expression grew even more serious. Unfortunately, yes. We believe they were responsible for 3 missing children cases that we've been investigating. 2 of those children were found safe yesterday, thanks to information we got from searching their van. The relief David felt hearing that those children were safe was overwhelming. But the reality of what could have happened to Lucy if he hadn't intervened was almost too much to process. "What was in the van?" David asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. Detective Rodriguez hesitated for a moment. The vehicle had been modified specifically for kidnapping. Restraints, soundproofing materials, and equipment for keeping victims unconscious during transport. They also had detailed maps of school routes and photographs of potential targets. David felt sick to his stomach. The level of planning and preparation these criminals had put into their operation was horrifying. They weren't random opportunists. They were organized predators who had been systematically targeting vulnerable children. "How did they choose their victims?" David asked. They had been following school walking routes and identifying children who regularly walked alone or in small groups. Lucy wasn't a random target. They had been watching her for at least a week before making their move today. The thought that these criminals had been stalking little Lucy, planning to harm her, made David's hands clench into fists. But it also made him realize how lucky it was that he had been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Detective Rodriguez continued. "The older suspect, Robert Chen, has a criminal history going back 15 years. Multiple convictions for assault, theft, and 1 previous kidnapping charge from 2018. His partner, Tommy Williams, has been in and out of prison since he was 18. David was taking notes, but his mind kept going back to Lucy and how brave she had been throughout the entire ordeal. "How is Lucy doing? Has she been reunited with her family?" "Yes, she's back home with her parents. They're incredibly grateful for what you did." The detective pulled out her phone and showed David a text message. "Actually, they asked me to give you this." The message was from Lucy's father, and reading it made David's eyes water. "Officer David saved our daughter's life today. We will never be able to thank him enough. Lucy keeps talking about the brave guard who protected her from the bad men. She wants to send him a drawing she made of him as a superhero. David had to take a deep breath before he could speak again. In his 8 years as a Royal Guard, he had never experienced anything that made him feel as proud of his job as this moment. "There's something else you should know," Detective Rodriguez said. "The investigation into this group led us to discover a much larger network. Chen and Williams were part of a trafficking ring that operated across 3 different countries. Your intervention today didn't just save Lucy. It helped us uncover an entire criminal organization." She showed David another set of photos. These, one showing multiple suspects being arrested in coordinated raids that had taken place just hours after the morning's incident. Interpol has been tracking this network for over a year. The evidence we found in the van, combined with the suspects' confessions, gave us everything we needed to take down the entire operation. David stared at the photos in amazement. "All of this happened because I noticed one little girl who looked lost. All of this happened because you paid attention, trusted your instincts, and took action when it mattered most," the detective corrected him. Most people would have assumed the child was with family members and looked the other way. Over the next several hours, David learned the full scope of what his actions had accomplished. The trafficking network had been responsible for the disappearance of 17 children across Europe over the past 2 years. Thanks to the investigation that started with Lucy's case, 14 of those children had been found and were being reunited with their families. 3 weeks later, David was back on his regular patrol route when he saw a familiar figure walking toward the palace gates. Lucy was holding hands with both of her parents, and she was carrying what looked like a large envelope. "Officer David," she called out when she spotted him, running over with her parents following behind. "Hello, Lucy," David said, kneeling down to her level. "How are you doing?" "I'm really good. I made you something." She handed him the envelope, which contained a colorful drawing of a man in a Royal Guard uniform standing protectively in front of a little girl with the words, "My hero," written in crayon at the top. Lucy's mother had tears in her eyes as she spoke to David. "We can never thank you enough for what you did. You gave us our daughter back." Her father nodded, struggling to find the right words. "The police told us about all the other children who were saved because of your actions that day. You're a hero to so many families." David looked down at Lucy's drawing and felt his own eyes getting misty. "I was just doing my job." Lucy was the real hero. She was smart and brave, and she remembered everything her parents taught her about staying safe. Lucy beamed with pride. "My mommy and daddy taught me never to go with strangers, and you taught me that police officers and guards are there to help when I'm scared." As David watched the family walk away, Lucy skipping happily between her parents, he reflected on how one ordinary morning had changed so many lives. His decision to pay attention to a lost-looking little girl had not only saved her, but had helped rescue children across multiple countries and put dangerous criminals behind bars where they belonged. That evening, David hung Lucy's drawing on his locker at work. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded that sometimes the most important moments in life come when you least expect them, and that being in the right place at the right time only matters if you're brave enough to take action when it counts.